From great suffering came a solution. Communities.
Injected.
Serene, beautiful places where disorder became harmony.
Do you know how to fly those?
Absolutely.
Do you get to fly to the edge?
Oh, yeah.
What's past there?
Don't know. We're not allowed to fly past that.
Let's go.
It's against the rules, Jonas.
They're called books.
Hello. My
I
name.
know who you are.
Who are you?
The giver. When the elders need guidance, I provide wisdom using memories of the past. Our world was different. There was more.
More?
Much more.
Red.
You'll see them all in time. All colors, all differences. Our people chose to do away with emotions. Those morning injections take them away.
When people have the freedom to choose, they choose wrong.
Tomorrow morning, skip your injection. I've been doing it for months. What do you feel?
He's not usually like this.
I'm surprised you're not more worried about him. I would be. Bring up Jonas's activity.
He's inquisitive.
You should know better than anyone.
The way things look and the way things are very different. Watch.
That's my father.
There is no way for me to prepare you for the truth.
He killed him.
The young and the old are killed.
For the good of all of us.
There are things you don't know.
You're scaring me.
Go back to your family unit.
It isn't my family, and neither is yours.
Jonas has become dangerous.
I know that there's something more. Something that has been stolen.
Comfortable?
Jonas,
There has to be a way to show them.
you can stop this. You can change things.
I want you to find him. And then I want you to lose him.
Please welcome to stage author Lois Lowry, director Philip Noyce, Brenton Thwaites, the star of The Giver, and Cameron Monaghan. And moderating today's discussion is Matt Jacobs from Huffington Post Entertainment.
I have two mics, too much power, guys. If middle school me knew that I was going to sit in front of Lois Lowry several years later, I have no idea what he would say, but here I am. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm sure most of you in the audience are familiar with The Giver and its reputation and its legacy that it's maintained over the years. I'm particularly curious for Britton and Cameron what role the novel played in your lives. Britton, I know you're from Australia. Did you encounter the novel prior to your involvement with the movie? And if so, what role did it play in your lives?
I mean, I hadn't read the novel before I was auditioning for the movie. I'm not sure. What about you?
Same here, bro.
Yeah. So I had been pretty aware of the book. It's taught in many schools across America, but I hadn't had a chance to read it beforehand.
You know, my mum couldn't get me to read anything as a kid.
Really?
As a teenager, I was one of those boys who was, outdoors skateboarding or at the beach or something. So for me, it was a hard thing to come to read books. I wish I had have read it though. I would have got so much from it. But the screenplay took me to the book.
So this movie, if anyone has tracked its development, is kind of a almost 2-decade-old movie that's been in development via Jeff Bridges and several others who've come to be involved with the project. Lois, I read that you've read several versions of this script over the years. Since it was first optioned way back in '95, movies back then had different pacings, different tones. What sort of strides have you seen the script take then when you were first reading it to now that it's coming out?
You know, Philip is probably the one to answer better questions about movies and the way they've changed over the years, but I did read the first screenplay by Bob Whitey back in 1996 in January. I remember it because I was on my way to Indonesia. I lived in Boston at the time, and so I stopped overnight in LA to catch my breath, and I had a quick dinner with Bob Whitey, who was about to start writing it. So that screenplay existed back then, and then there were many others written, and then the final one was written by Michael Mitnick. But he drew on the Whitey script, and Bob had gone on to do Curb Your Enthusiasm for some years, a very different sort of show.
Yeah, from The Giver to Curb Your Enthusiasm.
So the two screenwriters who will be given credit on the screen are Michael Mitnick and Bob Whitey, and I'm not sure what comes from which of them. But it's an interesting combination. And then there were all the ones in the middle that, for whatever reason, were discarded.
And Philip, what has your involvement with the movie, how have the screenplays that came before your involvement impacted the movie once you signed on?
Well, I didn't read all those screenplays. I read the book. And then did some work with Michael Mitnick on his adaptation. So for me, the book was the guiding light.
Now, I know that Jonas's age is altered in the movie. He receives his assignment as the receiver of memories at the ceremony of 12 in the book. And Brenton, you're now 25. His birthday was 2 days ago, so we can wish him a happy birthday.
But he looks closer to 12. And acts closer to 12 sometimes.
Not after my 25th birthday party. I think I look my age now.
Yeah. What went into the decision to cast a slightly older actor in the role, and how has that impacted the reception that some of the Giver purists might take to the adaptation?
Well, the decision was made to take the age of graduation in our society as the age for the kids to be assigned their position for life. We thought that might open it up slightly to a wider audience without sacrificing, within that particular cloistered community, without sacrificing the tenderness, the vulnerability of the characters. So, but, you know, maybe Lois can comment on what she thinks, because she wrote the original 12-year-old and now he's 17, so...
I think Jeff Bridges says the same thing. Both he and I were distressed to hear they were aging the characters up. And Jeff said he almost withdrew from the movie at that point. But he decided to stick with it. And I think both of us felt when we met the actors who were cast in the roles and then saw them on the screen, that it was a good decision and that we felt comfortable with it. And as Philip just described, there was the air of innocence and vulnerability that the character in the book has. And so after a while, you don't care whether they're 12 or 17. The essential elements are all still there.
Mm-hmm. Brenton, your love interest is played by Odeya Rush. The two of you in real life have a slight age difference as well. Did you have a lot of common ground despite that kind of off camera? And what sort of kinks did you guys have to work out kind of being at different stages in your own lives off screen in order for that to translate to the movie?
Well, it was almost like a parallel because Jonas, at the point in the story, has experienced love and has experienced pain. Actually, I don't know has he experienced pain at this point? And so he's emotionally a little pain. And so he's emotionally a lot more knowledgeable and fresh. And so I guess that unease worked to enhance the story. But I have to say, Odeya is so great to work with. She brings such a sense of fun and playfulness to acting, you know, which is the key, I guess, the goal.
Cameron, do you have any... I know Britton said that nobody could get him to read anything, but do you have any middle school staples that have been adapted into movies or that you would love to see adapted into movies in recent years, if not The Giver?
I was a big fan of the Artemis Fowl books. Around that age. I think I read every one in the series. that hasn't been adapted yet, so, you know, they'll have to get on that.
Absolutely. So, Lois, I read that you, in seeing the movie or in being involved with its development, wished that you had, obviously the movie amplifies the chief elder's role. Let me ask first, was this an opportunity for you guys to recruit Meryl Streep, or was there a need to create more conflict among the characters? What was the sort of origins of the chief elder, the way that chief elder is portrayed in the film?
Chief Elder starts off with a huge big scene at the graduation ceremony where the kids receive their assignments for life.
And that scene's in the book as well.
Yeah, and but then she sort of peters out.
Mm-hmm.
In the book,
In the book she does,
Yes.
yeah. So we thought about that character and what a grand entrance she had, what an important person she was in the community. And then Michael started writing more scenes for her. And then we cast Meryl Streep, and then he wrote more scenes for her.
Because once you have Meryl Streep cast, there must be more scenes.
To a degree, yeah.
And then, Lois, you said that you then kind of wished that you had made the chief elder a meatier role in the novel.
Well, when I saw what they had done with the role, first the screenwriters and then Meryl Streep in performing the role, it's just so fascinating and so complex, and it isn't that in the book. So yes, I felt as though, wouldn't it be neat to go back and rewrite the book and write that role into it? It elevates, it creates conflict between those two characters, Bridges and Streep, the people they play, that isn't in the book at all. On the other hand, if I were to go back and rewrite it, if one doesn't get that chance, but I'm not sure it would then be a book for young people. It would be much more of an adult book if I were focusing on those two characters.
Were there any other elements in the adaptation that you wished or that made you feel differently about the original source?
I think Asher's role, Cameron's role, the boy named Asher, is different in the movie from the book. In the book, Asher is an appealing character, but he's really there for comic relief. And you're not funny in the movie. Maybe a little bit. But Asher takes on a more complex role. He kind of veers into being something of a villain, and then he's redeemed in the end. We don't want to put any spoilers in here, but he's a more complex character than he is in the book.
And did any of you spend any time kind of absorbing or reabsorbing? I mean, dystopian lit is nothing new, but YA dystopian lit seems to have taken such a resurgence over the past decade. I think it owes a lot of debt of gratitude to The Giver. Did you guys take time to go back and read Huxley and Orwell and then watch The Hunger Games and all these newer versions? And what sort of roles has the dystopian tropes played in crafting the film?
Well, I think one of the fascinating things about The Giver is that in many ways the community isn't dystopian. At least on the surface level, it's utopian. You know, the discontent runs at a deeper level, and it's something that most people aren't even aware of, as opposed to a book like 1984 where the people are unhappy, but they're not able to say anything about it. So I think that it would actually, at least for me, it would have been misguided to try to approach some of those dystopian books, and also some of the more recent young adult fiction like Divergent or Hunger Games was spawned due to inspiration from The Giver and from what Lois had already written, so might as well just go to the initial source.
I have a question for Cameron, since you know more about it than I do. Since I don't really know the Hunger Games that well, are the people, would you describe them the way you just did, the people in 1984, are they unhappy?
Yeah, they're ruled by aristocracy from a small district of very wealthy people, and the rest are oppressed, yeah.
The difference with The Giver is that everyone except two people, Brendan's character and Jeff's character, everyone thinks that they're living in a perfect world.
And I tried to make them think that.
There's no unhappiness, there's no competition, there's no color.
That's right.
There's no love.
What would each of you miss if you were living about the real world, if you were living within the community that the Giver represents?
No music.
Music?
No books.
No love.
No McDonald's.
This book frequently appears on the list of most banned or most frequently challenged novels. There were lists from the most frequently challenged of the 90s, and it was on there. Again, for the 2000s, it was on there. But now that YA dystopia is so common, will it be on the list of books that are challenged in the 2000s? Or
I don't think so.
Have we moved past that?
I think, if they're looking for things to challenge and ban, there are a lot more things out there now that would be available to them. The Giver seems quite mild in its content compared to The Hunger Games, for example, which is about kids killing other kids. A lot of violence now. So, no, I think it's slipped off the list and probably won't come back.
Well, speaking of that violence, The Giver also doesn't come with the same sort of adrenaline and action that Divergent and all those do. I think it's more somewhat in the vein of kind of Never Let Me Go, your more introspective, dystopian pieces. What are your expectations as the movie opens? Do you think that modern audiences who maybe who the book weren't as integral to in middle school will still be able to appreciate it the way that they pine for the Jennifer Lawrence action of The Giver and Shailene Woodley and Divergent, et cetera?
Who are you asking?
All of you. Philip, Brenton.
We certainly hope so. I mean, this movie doesn't work in the ways that any of the other YA adaptations work. It's about yearning for something very deep to happen. It's about the very fundamental, it asks the fundamental questions of what makes us human. And it's also not science fiction, this is future projection. And even the bad parts of this community are really attractive. Wouldn't it be good if you could wake up every morning and not have any bad news blasting you from your car radio or the TV? No deaths, no maimings, no murders.
Right. As far as you know, at least.
As far as we know, yeah. No what?
I guess we'll open it up to audience questions for those of you who would like to ask something of our 4 Giver honchos.
Thanks. The Giver was coincidentally one of the only books that I did read when I was in high school. Sorry. How do you think in the current state of education that we can continue to get children and young adults interested in the type of literature that The Giver is, more introspective, more thought-provoking, and getting our generation to think about some of these issues?
Well, I think from what I hear from teachers, kids, often it's assigned reading, required reading, that terrible phrase that even I, when I was 12, groaned when something was deemed required reading. But teachers tell me that kids, even after the initial groan, start the book and they become attracted to the story, to the character. They identify with the character, which is always what I hope for when I create a character. And then they fall into the story and are carried along by it. What emerges after that, and the role of the teacher then is to help kids perceive what emerges, is the things that you think about after reading the book. But they read it as an adventure story and apparently have no problem with the fact that they're learning something from it, or that they're given food for thought, that the book raises questions, which is what good books always do. But I think the key for kids is that it be a good story, that you want to turn the page. I always start out every book, and I think I could go back over every book I've written, and there are 45 of them. I start out with a character that I try to make appealing to a young audience, and with a sense that something is not quite right. And in The Giver, I did it in one sentence. I think I can quote it. It was almost December, and Jonas was beginning to be frightened. In that sentence, you know something's wrong, and that's going to have to be righted by the end of the book. I do that in every book, a sense that something is askew. Musicians do it too. I am not a musician, but a symphony begins with a beautiful sound that then something is a little amiss, and the orchestra tries for the next 2 hours sometimes to make it come back to that original sound. And I think that's the role of the composer or the writer. And then if you do that well, the audience, the reader, the listener, the person who watches the movie is going to go along with you, waiting for the things to come together in the end.
That's the fifth sentence in the film. That something was wrong.
Oh, what's the first?
After the ruin.
Oh, okay. A little backstory. The movie has to begin with a little backstory to explain.
How much did the other, I know you wrote some companion novels and eventually a sort of direct sequel to it, how much did they influence The Giver as a movie?
I don't think they have at all. I'd be very surprised if any of the three people here have read the other three books.
Well, we know Brenton hasn't, that's for sure.
No, I actually have not.
And I think that's probably a good thing. You don't want to have these other things, finding their way into what was in itself a piece of work and a book. Sure. And yeah.
Others from the people.
Oh, hi. I have a question for Lois. Since you wrote the original books and then you handed them over to a screenwriter to adopt them, at what point as a writer, as a novelist, do you kind of just let go and let the screenwriters take over? And is there any sort of lingering preciousness about, this was my story, and now it's very different? I've actually always wondered that. So.
Well, I always knew from the beginning that a movie is going to be different from a book. I think a writer who hands over the rights to a book and expects the movie to be exactly the same, of course, is going to be disappointed, but is also naive going into it. A movie is not the same thing as a book. I put it, I felt, in the beginning, into good hands. And that was Jeff Bridges in 1995, because he was very, what's the word I want? He was very dedicated to the book, very passionate, that's the word I was looking for, very passionate about the book. And so he wanted to keep the elements in the book that were appealing to him and translate them, and he hired a good screenwriter to do that. I've forgotten the first part of your question now. But at any rate, I know. How do I let go of it? I don't have any problem with that. I finish a book in any case, even if it's not going to become a movie, I put it out there in the world. And everybody who picks it up is not going to read the same book that I wrote. Everybody brings their own history to it, their own beliefs, their own ideas. And so if I sell 1 million copies of a book, that means 1 million people are reading 1 million different books. And I'm aware of that. I don't cling to what I put in those pages.
Nevertheless, yes, you were sending me emails until about 3 weeks ago.
Yeah,
with suggestions.
I was arguing with some of the movie makers along the way.
I was going to ask, did the two of you ever disagree on any elements, or did either of you disagree with anybody else involved with the book on how it would be adapted?
I think only on details.
Only on details, and there was a lot of discussion about the last words in the novel and the last words in the movie.
Regarding the fact that the ending is ambiguous?
Yeah, a little bit. And we tried to capture the poetry of that last sentence that Lois wrote. Perhaps it was only an echo, what he was hearing. So we tried to marry the two. Hopefully we have.
I think you'll find the ambiguity is still there, but I always felt it was an optimistic ending, and I found readers often disagreed and felt that they were dead even. I think the movie retains an ambiguity, but increases the positive, the optimistic, the optimism of the ending.
When you were first writing the book, what were you thinking in your mind?
Well, golly.
That is a big question.
I was thinking, oh dear, I have to fill 200 pages with words here. I hope I choose the right ones. What I think every time I write a book is, who is this character? And how can I create this character? And how can I make this character's journey interesting? Always a book character has to start in one place and end someplace else. And the character has to be different at the end from what he is at the beginning. He has to have changed. And he's going to be changed by all the things that will happen to him on that journey. So I want, when I start out, to know that the reader will go on this journey with me and the character, and will also be changed by reading the book, the way the character in the book changes. Brenton, do you think you're different at the end of the movie than you are at the beginning?
Yes.
One more audience question. We have a couple over here. He's running the mic to you.
You need a microphone to ask questions.
Actually, you know, Lois, having heard your answers now many times.
Yes, many times.
I think your experience with your dad really started you to think about that novel. I mean, maybe you could tell us about that, because that's very moving.
Okay. Before I began to write this particular book, which was maybe the 20th I'd written or the 25th, my father was getting old, and I went often to visit him, but this particular visit, I realized that he was starting to lose his memory, and in particular, he had forgotten my older sister. His first child was a daughter, 3 years older than I, and she had died young. I had written a book earlier about that experience, but at any rate, this particular time, visiting my father, I showed him a picture in a photograph album, and he smiled, and he said, "There you are with your sister," and then he suddenly said, "I can't remember her name." And I told him her name, and then he said, after a moment, "Whatever happened to her?" And I had to tell him about her death. And when I was driving my rental car back to the airport that day, I began to think about that, about what it would be like if we could somehow, magically perhaps, or through science, control people's memory so that they wouldn't have to remember the terrible things that had happened in their lives. And my father had forgotten the worst day of his life. Maybe that was a good thing. And of course, when a writer begins to think that way, what if this, what if that, then a story begins to take shape. And that was, by the time I got home, I realized the story I would next write would be about a group of people who had somehow found a way to manipulate human memory. Very quickly, I realized it had to be set in the future. This was 20 years ago that I was writing it. Oddly now, I've recently read articles that they have found ways to manipulate the memory in mice. And so, folks, this is soon to be coming to your neighborhood. So it's not perhaps that far in the future. But 20 years ago, I realized I'd have to write a book set in the future. I'd never been a reader of science fiction, but suddenly that's what I was writing, though I didn't put the science into it, because I don't know the science.
What year is the book set? Do you have a year in mind?
I don't, but my grandson, age 13, tells me he envisions it being 50 years in the future.
Not that far off.
And when Philip asked me in an email from South Africa, what should the boy's bedroom look like? And I replied, very stark, nothing decorative, maybe something educational, maybe a poster showing the periodic table of elements. And when I told that to my 13-year-old grandson, he said, well, 50 years from now, there won't be any helium. Who knew? My grandson.
I think we have one more audience question over here.
Hi, my question is for Lois. I heard that you have some crazy fans, and I just wanted to know if you had any good stories about what the weirdest thing a fan has ever asked you.
The weirdest thing that a fan has ever asked me. Well, several. One sent me a book. A young man sent me a book and asked me if I would write it. And people often do. And if they include return postage, I'll sign them and send them back. But this guy wanted me to write, it was a gift for his girlfriend, but he wanted me to write, will you, or whatever his name was, Steve wants to know if you will marry him. So I was part of that proposal. And the answer was yes. He later let me know. But one of the more interesting was from a young woman who said she didn't know enough about copyright law, but she thought she probably should ask me. She was planning to have a passage from The Giver tattooed on her shoulder blade. And did she need my permission?
Did you give it to her?
I said, if I were your mother, I would say no. But and she did go ahead. She sent me a picture of it afterward.
What was the passage?
I can't remember. I'm sorry.
I'll close by asking Brenton and Cameron whether you guys are aware of and how you feel about the legacy that you'll now take with particularly, I think, people my age, millennials, but also the current generation that might be reading this book in middle school, and the teachers who might show it on a rainy day, and the moviegoers who have flocked to the theater to see their middle school staple projected on the big screen, how you guys feel about being part of the people who are going to carry on that legacy.
I think the teachers should ask questions about stuff that's only in the movie, but not in the book, and see if the kids actually read the book or if they were trying to cheat. Like, how old were they in the book? 16? No. Oh,
what
sorry.
color were their eyes?
Yeah.
The teachers should only allow their students to see the movie if they've read the book, and if they have someone like me in their class, then it's going to be quite a challenge. But I hope a lot of questions are raised in the education of this book. It's a great opportunity for young people to learn about the ethics of becoming an adult.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all so much for being here. Congratulations on the movie.